Well, David, I have a couple of threads I'm going to try to pull together here, and hopefully this makes sense.
Right.
I listened to a podcast from Jocko Willink. For those of you who don't know, Jocko Willink is a retired Navy SEAL. He's written several books. We use some of them in our leadership training for our Ascend team leaders and Unbound, and so we're pretty familiar with this stuff. He has a podcast. It's long form like Joe Rogan, which means I don't listen to them very often. I never have that much time, but I pick through and probably listen to one every 50 or 75 or something like that catches my eye. There's a shorter one. It was released on May 30th. It was Jocko Underground. It's interesting. I couldn't find it on the website, so there's no link below. It showed up in my podcast feed, and so I assume you have to Google or something to find it. But it was called ChatGPT versus Jocko Willink. And what was really fascinating was they asked ChatGPT to define Jocko Willink, to talk about his things. And what was striking to me was that when ChatGPT did so, they said what on the surface would look to be the case. So they talk about Jocko Willink having a hard-charging leadership style. What would be some of the criticisms of Jocko Willink? Well, he only has one perspective, and he's not nuanced and all those kinds of things. If you look at a picture of Jocko Willink, he looks like what you might expect a bruising SEAL warrior, maybe lineman, like a hard-charging physical warrior type to be.
Yep.
And so ChatGPT's description would meet that. And if you look at clips of him on the internet, and especially on YouTube, he talks about getting up early and not resting and, get it done and some kind of stereotypical advice that you might expect from a Navy SEAL. The problem with this is that Jocko Willink has written a book called The Dichotomy of Leadership. And so even a fairly cursory examination of Willink's writings, or certainly listening to any amount of his podcasts, will portray a pretty nuanced figure there. And I'm no apologist for Jocko Willink. I'm not even a big super fan necessarily. I know who he is, and I appreciate some of the work he's done. But it was almost laughable to hear ChatGPT's descriptions, because just a small working knowledge of who he is would show those to be at the very best, this very kind of surface level thing. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about it in a couple of terms. One, we talked last week about AI looking more like Star Wars, right? So that we have droids in Star Wars, but they're never the main characters. I was thinking about the character in the series C-3PO. Obviously, C-3PO has these amazing data banks. He's always talking about, I'm versed in 3 million languages or 3 billion languages, and he knows all this stuff. And so the characters in the film often refer to him, and they need certain information from him. And, and he can talk to other computers and all those kinds of things in a way that no human could do. And yet he's played for comedic effect because he fails to understand even the very cursory human emotion that happens. He constantly misreads the relationship between the main characters, especially Han Solo and Princess Leia, particularly in the Empire Strikes Back movie. And what's interesting is that everybody in the audience laughs because everybody in the audience gets what C-3PO can't. It's as obvious as a neon sign. Almost nobody can miss it. Everybody knows what's going on. And yet it's too subtle for a droid to catch. And this is interesting because ChatGPT is sort of like that, right? It did a quick stereotype of Willink that anybody that spends 5 minutes studying Jocko Willink can realize is just a cursory surface explanation of this. Now, combined with one other piece, I listened to a podcast this week by Mike Rowe. So it's the most recent one if you look at the date of this podcast and what his was. And he interviewed an astronaut, and they were talking about various things. But at one point, Rowe asked him about fully automated ships and things like that. And he said something that really, I paused it and rewound it and jumped back and read and listened to it again. He said, you can never eliminate the human element. And so what we have to be careful about is when we're building automations into things that fly at high speeds in ways that can kill people, right? So that would be like space shuttles and craft going to the moon and to Mars and to the International Space Station, that you have a choice. You can rely on the failings of a human pilot and the human failure that's built into a human pilot who can't calculate all the angles and stuff like that, like a machine. Or you can pass that off and you can rely on the failings of code developed by humans. In other words, the human failures are then passed on, but they're now encoded into the software of the system. And that's fascinating. If you now take my last step, I swear, David, if you look at the what was the Boeing aircraft was it 787 Max or 737 Max? 737 Max, right?
That sounds correct. Yes.
I think it was a 737 Max. A couple of them crashed and killed a lot of people. Why did they crash? Because a software glitch had the machine doing all the wrong things and would crash the plane before the pilots could take it over. The pilots in an instant knew that it was wrong, but the machine was sure that it was right and it crashed them. Well, why did the machine think so? Because the code was wrong, which means human error got in. And in this case, it was more catastrophic than pilot error. If the pilot of the plane had done that, the co-pilot would say, no, dude, that's the wrong thing to do. Shift it, right? Or somebody else would have done it. Or immediately they could have figured out what was wrong and adjusted those. But since it was hard coded into the system, it had very little ability to correct. That's something to keep in mind as we think about AI and these automations and things like that. There is not really a situation where you eliminate human error. And in the case of Willink, it's very interesting because what you're getting broad-based stereotypes that are showing up through AI, which is really a reflection of things that were already encoded into the system. And so you're getting human error, but now you're getting human error magnified in some ways. You're getting things that work really well, but you're also getting things magnified. When you have a 737 Max, you have a flight system that can solve a lot of pilot problems, but can also kill pilots and passengers because it's so deeply buried in it that when it messes up, the results are often catastrophic. So you're almost trading off like these minor problems that could become major problems on the pilot side with mostly perfection, except for the catastrophic failures that are unfixable if you pass those, human failures onto the automation side. And you'll see a little bit of that in AI. So anyhow, some interesting perspective to think about in terms of what AI can and can't do. So, all right, David, was that too many leaps? I think I pulled together Navy SEALs, Jocko Willink, C-3PO, 737 Max, and Mike Rose. So I'm pretty sure that's I'd like to see AI try to do something like that, right? So.
That is quite a series of connections, yeah. But I tracked with you for the most part.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Did you hear that, folks? That was a very gracious for the most part. That was David saying 90% of what you said. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm just going to smile and nod. So.
Well, what I was going to say is two things that I find particularly interesting. I think that primarily your point about the fact that you really can't ever avoid human error. It's just where the human error comes from, I think, is really significant. And I think just about anybody that is in technology or software development or anything like that will verify that, yes, even with the most advanced computer systems, ultimately will have errors. And the reason for that is because of humans that are behind those systems.
But isn't it interesting to just jump in quickly?
Okay.
I was so one of the guys was here recently, posted in our one of our Send Slack channels that he had gotten stranded at an airport because of systems that went wrong, right? And then he tried to eat dinner, and he got a great seat at the only restaurant at the airport, his little small regional airport. And the computer system went down, and so he couldn't get served. Now, what's interesting is that both those cases, what do we say? Those daggone computers messed up and stranded him in a little regional airport where he can't get fed, right? And yet, David, that's not really what happened, is it? Right? I mean, it was human errors that got magnified and blown way up in both the flight software systems and the computer system that ultimately prevented things, and a catastrophe where so a waitress might have forgotten your order. One person in the restaurant didn't get served. Somewhere a code problem happened and an entire restaurant shut down. Nobody got fed and all that revenue was lost. But it's really interesting that we don't think of those secondary things as human errors. And yet they are. They're just human errors that then multiply and have a bigger force effect because they're automated. And that was a pretty interesting, that didn't occur to me till I listened to this astronaut. I wish I could remember his name. I'm sorry for that. I'm not giving him due credit here. So sorry to cut you off, but.
Yeah, well, and I think ultimately, even in your ChatGPT example, ultimately the way that comes about is not just an error in the developers of ChatGPT. What makes it interesting is that ChatGPT learned from humans who put out perspectives and opinions online. And so at least my guess for why a lot of those very short-sighted generalizations of Jocko Willink were were given as an answer by ChatGPT is because it is sourcing it from a lot of short-sighted, uninformed opinions that were put online by people who just didn't even take the time to do a tiny bit of research. And so, yeah, ultimately, even with just the amazing things that AI can do with things like software development and coding, there's just absolutely so much potential for human error. And the thing that it reminds me of, especially when you were talking about the astronaut thing, was self-driving technologies and sort of some of the controversy around that. And actually, I referenced him earlier in the episode. A YouTuber named Marquez Brownlee did a really interesting video where he filmed his entire commute, which is in a very busy part of New Jersey, between his home and his office. And he filmed it in his Tesla trying to use full autopilot. And what was super interesting is just observing the different scenarios where you could tell that the autopilot was struggling with how to adapt to certain circumstances, and the few points where Marquez, the driver, had to actually take over. And just ultimately that, yes, self-driving technology has come a long way, and there's a lot more way for it to come along, but ultimately because, yeah, it's software. It's something that is developed by humans, and there's absolutely still going to be potential for error no matter how refined the system gets.
Yeah, there's interesting things there because, again, like the C-3PO example, often there are things that are really easy. There's a channel on YouTube called Fort9. They do a lot of videos about motorcycles, and they had a video not that long ago about how a lot of motorcycle riders were getting killed by Teslas, and they almost always were getting killed because the Teslas hit them from behind. And so there was Tesla's kind of ignoring it, but this channel did a little in-depth work on the technology behind it and came to the conclusion that if a motorcycle has two close together headlights, that Tesla is likely, the Tesla AI is looking at that and they think that that is a car very far in the distance. When in fact it's a motorcycle very, very, very close. If you can see the distinction between two things. And so the Tesla thinks there's lots and lots of space when in fact, now what is interesting to me about that, I mean, it's interesting as a motorcyclist, in terms of how that all works, but just think about that. There's really the dumbest human driver can recognize a motorcycle close up. They can hear it. They can see it. They can, like there's so many things that would be hard to you to explain, but in a fraction of a millisecond, you would see that and be able to positively identify it. And yet, an AI, which is in many ways vastly superior intellectually to a human in terms of all the stuff it processes, can't get something that for even a small child would be able to look out the window and almost instantly their brain would tell them what that was. And so that's kind of an interesting reflection here in terms of there's an enormous amount of human intuition and knowledge that is always in some ways going to be faster and more natural than an AI. But it's also when you look at any kind of AI, it is indeed an artificial intelligence of a sort, with the emphasis on the artificial, and that it's going to encode, reproduce, sometimes on a massive scale, human error. And if maybe our big concluding alternative idea for the day for this section is that if you fail to account for human error and recognize that even in something like AI, you do not have a realistic nor an accurate view of the world. If you look for it and accept that it's going to be there, then that's probably puts you ahead in terms of your expectations and being able to walk through the world as a realist who understands the world as it really is. And I would just end from our perspective that as a Christian, this all makes sense, right? We're not God. We don't have perfection. We live in a fallen, broken world that's marred by sin. And so it is not surprising to us to find that sin reflected in anything that humans create, including something like AI. So.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching through this clip of the Alternative Ideas podcast. If you'd like to see other clips just like this one or the full episodes where we have discussions just like this, you can check all of them out on the channel.